funds and advance negotiations around hostages. But until we pool efforts for an international response, we will not be able to manage this crisis sustainably. If the current situation continues over the next few days, while we are safe at home with our loved ones during the festive period, civilians in Gaza will be dying either from military strikes or the secondary impacts of war, hunger, disease, and widespread infection. This Council has a responsibility to ensure that they are not victimized twice over. We have extensively negotiated and tried to find language that meets everyone's concerns, but also addresses this challenge with a practical response. I'd like to thank each and every Council member who has contributed to this text and improved it, and I'd like to thank the United States for their complete engagement in trying to find a resolution that meets the moment. Let's not reject this resolution when the needs of people are so great. If we do, it will be an additional responsibility that this Council and the Palestinian people will have to bear. Thank you, Mr. President.
A la representante de Emiratos Árabes Unidos por su declaración. Tiene ahora la palabra el representante de la Federación Rusa.
Господин председатель, за последние несколько дней Совет Безопасности, а вместе с ним и весь мир, стал свидетелем очередного, не побоюсь этого слова, позорного, циничного и безответственного поведения Соединенных Штатов, которые, пытаясь избежать ответственности за очередное применение вето, прибегали к самым разным инструментам саботажа принятия Советом Безопасности решения по Газе. Мировые СМИ и общественность все это время задавались вопросом, почему все время откладывается голосование по предложенному Объединенными Арабскими Эмиратами проекту, который уже был выложен в СИМ. Ответ очень прост. Соединенные Штаты под разными предлогами затягивали переговорный процесс, уклоняясь от нормальной транспарентной переговорной работы. Вместо этого они прибегли к своей излюбленной тактике грубого давления, шантажа и выкручивания рук с тем, чтобы в последний момент поставить членов Совета перед ультиматумом. Либо Совет покорно принимает удобный для Вашингтона текст, либо Соединенные Штаты вновь заблокируют принятие любого продукта. Проект, который сейчас выставлен на голосование, был изначально, по нашему мнению, весьма беззубым. Но, уважая инициативу наших арабских друзей и их потребности, мы были готовы его поддержать. Под давлением США, которые фактически перехватили авторство и узурпировали работу над текстом, в кулуарах на разных уровнях выкручивая руки регионалам, текст с каждой новой редакцией терял все больше и больше важных положений. В итоге, та редакция, которая поставлена на голосование сегодня, оказалась до крайности выхолощенной, в том числе и в ОП-4, по механизму, который был бы призван облегчить поставки помощи в Газу и обеспечить ее мониторинг. Но хуже всего то, что стараниями американской делегации проект резолюции вобрал в себя крайне опасный для будущего Газа элемент. Вместо формулировок про немедленное прекращение насилия в ОП-2 появилась двусмысленная фраза про призыв к сторонам создавать условия для прекращения боевых действий. Коллеги, уничтожение или перемещение, или выселение населения Газы в циничном прочтении, а именно так это и будет прочитано Израилем, тоже создает условия для прекращения боевых действий. Подписавшись под этим, Совет фактически даст израильским вооруженным силам полную свободу рук на дальнейшую зачистку анклава. И каждый, кто проголосует за текст в этой редакции, будет нести за это ответственность, фактически превратившись в соучастника уничтожения Газа. Кроме того, из текста проекта ушло упоминание осуждения всех неизбирательных атак на мирное население. Какой сигнал это пошлет международному сообществу? Что Совет Безопасности ООН дает Израилю зеленый свет на военные преступления? Я хочу задать членам Совета Безопасности вопрос. Для чего мы с вами собираемся в этом зале? Чтобы проштамповать удобное Вашингтону решение или все же, чтобы выполнить возложенный на нас мандат по поддержанию международного мира и безопасности? Мы все же исходим из того, что ради второго. Чтобы дать Совету шанс сохранить лицо и изрядно пошатнувшуюся за последние дни репутацию, мы предлагаем вернуть в него формулировки из изначального проекта в Синьке по прекращению насилия. Российская Федерация предлагает следующую устную поправку в ОП-2. вместо формулировки «and in this regard calls for urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered and expanded humanitarian access and to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities», внести формулировку and in this regard calls for an urgent suspension of hostilities to allow safe and unhindered humanitarian access and for urgent steps towards a sustainable cessation of hostilities. Эта формулировка была в тексте проекта резолюции, положенного авторами в синьку и ожидавшего голосования. Безусловно, она не идеальна. Вам всем хорошо известно, что Россия с самого начала последовательно отстаивала необходимость немедленного прекращения огня. К тому же сторона призвала недавно в своей резолюции Генеральная Ассамблея. Однако мы предлагаем формулировку, которая является на данный момент наименьшим общим знаменателем для практически всех членов Совета. Пусть голосование по этой поправке будет моментом истины и покажет, кто из членов Совета Безопасности хочет остановить насилие в Газе и спасти жизни мирных жителей, а кто руководствуется конъюнктурными соображениями. Коллеги, то, как сформулирован текст ОПИТУ сейчас, это главное, что нужно США в этой резолюции. Под лукавой фразой, содержащей слова создания условий для прекращения боевых действий, развязать Израилю руки для дальнейших, ничем не ограниченных по времени и ничем не сдерживаемых, неизбирательных бомбардировок гражданской инфраструктуры и гражданского населения Газа. Призываем делегации проголосовать в поддержку предложенного нами сейчас, а изначально делегации Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов, языка в ОПИТУ по прекращению насилия. Благодарю вас.
Agradezco al representante de la Federación Rusa por su declaración. Los miembros del Consejo tienen ante sí una propuesta de enmienda presentada por la Federación Rusa al texto de proyecto de resolución que figura en el documento S-2023-1029. El artículo 36 del Reglamento Provisional del Consejo dispone, entre otras cosas, lo siguiente. Cuando una enmienda entrañe una adición o una supresión al texto de una moción o proyecto de resolución, esa enmienda deberá ser sometida a votación en primer término. Por consiguiente, tengo la intención de someter a votación la propuesta de enmienda en primer lugar. Quienes estén a favor de la propuesta de enmienda, levanten la mano. En contra. Abstenciones. El resultado de la votación es el siguiente: 10 votos a favor, 1 voto en contra, 4 abstenciones. La propuesta de enmienda no ha sido aprobada debido al voto en contra de un miembro permanente del Consejo de Seguridad. Entiendo que el Consejo está listo para someter a votación el proyecto de resolución que figura en el documento S-2023. Previo a esto, vamos a dar la palabra a los Estados Unidos que han solicitado.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to respond to Russia's rant, a country that has also created conditions that they are complaining about now in their unprovoked war in Ukraine. But colleagues, the United States, as you see, we did not support the amendment put forward by Russia. We believe the humanitarian resolution before us calls for urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access and to create the conditions for sustainable cessation of hostilities. This is a strong step forward, and we believe the Council should speak out in the amendments, in the resolution that's been put before us, and move forward with a vote on this resolution. So thank you very much.
Agradezco a la representante de Estados Unidos por su declaración. Procedamos ahora. Entiendo que el Consejo está listo para someter a votación el proyecto de resolución que figura en el documento S-2023-1029. Someteré ahora a votación el proyecto de resolución. Quienes estén a favor del proyecto de resolución que figura en el documento S-2023-1029, sírvanse levantar la mano. En contra. Abstenciones. El resultado de la votación es el siguiente: 13 votos a favor, 0 votos en contra, 2 abstenciones. El proyecto de resolución queda aprobado como resolución 2720. Daré ahora la palabra a los miembros del Consejo que deseen formular una declaración después de la votación. Tiene ahora la palabra la representante de los Estados Unidos.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, fellow council colleagues. This was tough, but we got there. Since the start of this conflict, the United States has worked tirelessly to alleviate this humanitarian crisis, to get life-saving assistance into Gaza and to get hostages out of Gaza, to push for the protection of innocent civilians and humanitarian workers, and to work towards a lasting peace. Today's vote bolsters those efforts and lends support to our direct diplomacy. And I want to thank the UAE and others for working with us in good faith to craft a strong humanitarian-focused resolution. It took many days and many long nights of negotiating to get this right. But today, this council provided a glimmer of hope amongst a sea of unimaginable suffering. Today, this council called for urgent steps to immediately allow safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access, and to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. I'll note that this is the first time this council has used this language we believe is critical to scaling up aid and underscoring the tough steps ahead as we work together to achieve a lasting peace. Colleagues, today this council made clear that addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza needs to remain at the forefront of our agenda. Today this council made clear that all hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally, and that humanitarian groups must be able to access hostages, including for medical visits. Today, this council made clear that all parties must respect international humanitarian law. Today, this council made clear that civilian and humanitarian facilities, including hospitals, medical facilities, schools, places of worship, and UN facilities, as well as humanitarian personnel and medical personnel, must be protected. This applies to all parties to this conflict. To Israel, but also to Hamas, a terror group that instigated this conflict and that wages war from inside homes and hospitals and UN sites and uses innocent civilians as human shields, an act of cowardice and cruelty. Colleagues, today this council made clear the need to ensure humanitarian personnel and assistance, including fuel, food, medical supplies, and emergency shelter assistance, can reach people in need. It is hard to overstate how urgent this is. Just yesterday, humanitarian groups released a report on the dire food security crisis in Gaza, and the word famine has started to enter the vocabulary of humanitarian leaders I've met with. Surgeries are being performed without anesthesia. People are huddled in overcrowded UN shelters. Others are sleeping in the streets. This resolution speaks to the severity of this crisis, and it calls on us all to do more. For our part, the United States has worked tirelessly to scale up the delivery of humanitarian aid through direct, persistent presidential diplomacy. In the beginning of this conflict, we helped secure an agreement to open the Rafah crossing. Last month, we helped secure a deal that led to an extended humanitarian pause, during which more than 100 hostages were released and additional aid got into Gaza. And last week, we helped secure the opening of the crossing at Kerem Shalom for direct delivery of assistance to civilians in Gaza. This resolution puts the weight of the Security Council behind these efforts and bolsters them by calling for the appointment of a senior UN official who will work to expedite the delivery of humanitarian aid at scale and in a sustained way. We know humanitarians are already doing the impossible, and we are there to do everything in our power to support their life-saving work. It is vital that when implementing this resolution, the UN builds on the progress we have seen on the ground. And we look forward to this new official working with humanitarian actors and relevant parties, including Israel. We know so much more needs to be done to address this humanitarian crisis and to lay the groundwork for a lasting peace. And let's be clear, Hamas has no interest in a lasting peace. Hamas is determined to repeat the horrors of October 7th over and over and over again. And that is why the United States supports Israel's right to protect its people from acts of terror. And I'll note that the resolution does not support any steps that would leave Hamas in power, which in turn would undermine the prospects for a two-state solution, where Gaza and the West Bank are reunited under a single governance structure, under a revamped and revitalized Palestinian Authority. We must, colleagues, we must work towards a future where Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in peace. This is the only way forward. Ultimately, while we are encouraged that the Council spoke out on this humanitarian crisis, we're deeply disappointed, appalled actually, that once again, the Council was not able to condemn Hamas's horrific terrorist attack on October 7th. And I can't understand why some Council members are standing in the way and why they refuse to condemn these evils unequivocally. Why is it so hard to condemn Hamas for slaughtering young people at a concert, for burning families alive, for the reports of widespread sexual violence? Why? I will never understand why some Council members have remained silent in the face of such evil. But colleagues, we also believe this Council must continue to put its support behind the resumption of humanitarian pauses. Israel has made clear that it's committed to reaching another agreement. This is now entirely up to Hamas. Hamas must agree to additional pauses. That is how we can get additional aid in and save lives and additional hostages out immediately. Today, this Council spoke out, but we know that only progress on the ground can turn these words into action. So the United States will continue to work with the UN, with humanitarian groups, and countries in the region to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza, to secure the release of hostages and to work towards a lasting peace. There is no time to waste. We must find a path forward to end the misery we're seeing. It's unbearable to see a Palestinian child shivering in fear after their home was destroyed. It's unbearable to see the families of hostages experience such pain and grief as they frantically await and pray for their loved ones to return. My heart is filled with pain, and I know the same is true for so many people around the world. So we must work together to alleviate this tremendous suffering once and for all. Thank you.
Agradezco a la representante de Estados Unidos por su declaración. Tiene ahora la palabra la representante de Reino Unido.
Thank you, President. The United Kingdom welcomes the adoption of this resolution to get more aid into Gaza. As my Foreign Secretary has said, it is heartbreaking to see children in the rubble of their destroyed homes, not knowing where to find food or water, not knowing where their parents are. It's also heartbreaking to hear the stories of families who still do not know the whereabouts of their loved ones who were brutally taken on the 7th of October. And it's heart-wrenching to know that aid is piling up outside Gaza, but not getting to the people that need it, when we hear daily warnings that people are starving, disease is spreading, and basic health care is lacking. The UK is doing everything we can to get more aid in. We have tripled UK aid to the region. We were the first country to call on Israel to open more crossings. The UK has experts on the ground providing logistical support at Al Arish in Egypt. And today, we supported this resolution, which will streamline aid checks so we can massively scale up the humanitarian response. It demands the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, and it calls for steps towards a sustainable cessation of hostilities. And for the avoidance of doubt, we are clear that the resolution is without prejudice to the rights and obligations of parties under international humanitarian law. The adoption is an important signal of the Security Council's commitment. Our actions today and in the future must help ensure that the horror of the 7th of October never happens again. We unequivocally condemn Hamas's acts of terror and support Israel's right to self-defense. My Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have been loud and clear in their calls for a sustainable ceasefire as soon as possible. But a ceasefire will not last if Hamas is still able to operate in tunnels and to launch rocket attacks. Our commitment to Israel's security is firm as Israel deals with the threat from Hamas. Ultimately, we support a two-state solution that guarantees true security and stability for both Israeli and Palestinian people. We also thank the UAE for their leadership on this resolution. Just this week, my Foreign Secretary and the Minister for the Middle East travelled to Jordan and Egypt to make sure that we are supporting every effort to get aid in faster. And we will keep working with all partners to deliver a humanitarian response that meets the huge level of need. I thank you.
Gracias. Agradezco a la representante de Reino Unido por su declaración. Tiene ahora la palabra el representante de Brasil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Brazil welcomes today's adoption. We thank the United Arab Emirates for tirelessly conducting and facilitating the negotiations and also for organizing the trip to Rafah, which enabled a first-hand account of the challenging humanitarian work being carried out in the region. This terrible crisis tests our humanity daily. The time for a humanitarian response to the suffering of civilians in Gaza is now, not tomorrow, not when this conflict finally ends. After more than 70 days of hostilities, the situation in Gaza is dire. The remaining hostages must be released immediately. Civilians and civilian facilities must be protected. This is not just a moral or ethical choice, it is an obligation under international humanitarian law, as is humanitarian access. The amount of aid allowed into Gaza must be substantially increased to meet the needs of the people who depend on it throughout Gaza and should contain all essential items, including fuel. Egypt's efforts to facilitate the use of Rafah crossing by United Nations humanitarian agencies and their implementing partners has been crucial. We welcome the recent announcement by Israel of the opening of the Kerem Shalom crossing for the direct delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Brazil calls for the full implementation of the adopted resolutions. Today's resolution provides for a monitoring mechanism for the UN to inspect the delivery of aid. The UN must be provided with the necessary means to carry out this task. The aim is to increase and expedite the entry and delivery of much-needed international assistance. The Council must remain seized of the matter for as long as it takes. And Mr. President, since this is probably our last formal session during our current mandate, I would like to thank all members of this Council for the trust and cooperation with our delegation during these 2 years. I speak on behalf of my entire delegation and of my capital in expressing how much we appreciated working with all of you at different levels and in a vast array of very important topics on the UN agenda of peace and security. We end our term with a sense of accomplishment of the priorities that Brazil always sets when discharging its duties at the UN in general and as a non-permanent member of this Council. We tried our best to engage constructively with all delegations in order to achieve concrete results in this vast and complex agenda of international peace and security in a growingly complex and challenging world. 5 participations of our foreign minister at Council meetings in October, in November on the Palestine question illustrate the importance we attach to the Council and to the matters under its consideration. We championed our positions while respecting the diversity of values, opinions and interests within the Council in order to adequately fulfill our role as a non-permanent member for the 11th time in this body's history. Once again, with President Lula's leadership and personal involvement, Brazil tried hard to make a serious contribution to this collective effort by just being Brazil, the Brazil that is back, a country that talks to every country in the friendliest ways, has no quarrels except with poverty, inequality, and inhumanity and injustice, has an engaged interest in all important matters discussed in the UN, that builds bridges, seeks consensus, acts faithfully as an honest broker, and values and defends peace, the international law, multilateralism, and their synthesis and symbol, the Charter of the United Nations. And most of all, if I may borrow Lincoln's words, a country that acts without malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. And if I may add a personal note, I'm most thankful for these 6 months of crash course in multilateral affairs in this worldly classroom. You, dear colleagues, and your teams have all been wonderful teachers to this old bilateralist who hopes to have learned at least some of the multiple skills and statesmanship that you show here every single session. Thank you very much again, and happy holidays. Thank you.
Agradezco al representante de Brasil por su declaración.